My name is Andy Blunden. I was born in October 1945, which, as I understand it, makes me part of the second batch to come up in the lottery. I went to an ordinary state high school and I got into engineering to study civil engineering, which was madness, really, because every one of my fellow students and lecturers knew that I was never going to be an engineer, but it took me a couple of years to find that out. But it did put me into, on that side of my life, a pretty conservative milieu surrounded by public school boys who mostly would have been voting Liberal if they'd had the vote, which they didn't. That wasn't the entire of my milieu, but that was what I was immediately surrounded with. My parents, as it happens, had both been members of the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s. They had pulled out of any involvement in the party following the banning of the Communist Party in 1940, thereabouts, and Hungary finished them off. But they were still in that milieu. They belonged to us, that circle of intellectuals, actually in the artists branch. But the nature of my family was I did not know any of this until after I'd left home, because they believed that children should make up their own mind, and that included solving the problems of the world. So when I got my draft card, when I found I'd been drawn in the lottery, and later went on to decide that I was going to defy the draft, and I made an arrangement with the Youth Campaign Against Conscription. To step back to tell that story, I was lightly involved in the different demonstrations that were taking place in 64, 65, 66 against conscription and against the war. As very much a peripheral foot soldier. I was studying engineering. It was a very exacting course. I was not a political person. I'd had no political education at home as an engineering student. I didn't have the same awareness of social affairs that my fellow art students had, though, as I said, I wasn't regarded as a real engineering student, and my lecturers were aware I was far too politically aware for anyone's good. But I did decide that I would have to defy this. I had enough imagination to know what it meant to go off to war and how I would fit into the army lifestyle. And I could put myself and my imagination in Vietnam, and I knew that this was disaster for me and it was wrong. So it was a combination, the things that were motivating me at the time was a combination of a genuine awareness of what was at issue and a genuine awareness of my own nature, my own capabilities. For example, I did fantasize about joining the army and then deserting and joining the other side, but I knew that this was a sheer fantasy and an impossibility. Fantasies are okay, but you don't act on them. An example of my political awareness at the time, I remember I went into the Bailey Library and I looked up the Geneva Convention, which of course was only 10 years old at that time. It seems to us like ancient history now, to me. It did at the time seem like ancient history a mere 10 years ago. But I read there that the Americans had no right to be in Vietnam, that they had invaded the country, and it was obvious. And you had these clips on the news showing American soldiers bearing guns, chasing Vietnamese farmers into barbed wire enclosures with a voiceover telling us that the Americans were protecting the Vietnamese from the Viet Cong army. All my friends believed this, and it was my introduction to philosophical problems. In fact, I did pick up accidentally a copy of Descartes' Discourse on Method at the same conjuncture. How is it that things are so blindingly obvious and yet social consciousness holds it to be the opposite? But I have to say, at that time, that was social consciousness, that the Vietnam War was a good thing and the Americans, and consequently, in time, we would be there, we Australians would be there to protect the Vietnamese from this dreadful invasion coming from the north. The only people who were challenging that were basically the Communist Party, a tiny minority. My memory was that there was no movement against the war in 66. When I came back in 86, say, back from overseas. I checked up the newspapers at the time, and that's not true. Every day there was a demonstration or a protest somewhere, but it was a handful of people who were given hell by the police and were very isolated from the mainstream of the community. Anyway, I made up my mind that I would burn my draft card, so I approached Trevor Ashton, I suppose he was the secretary of the Youth Campaign Against Conscription. I'd seen him at the demos and he looked like he was someone in charge, and I told Trevor that I would like to burn my draft card, but I didn't wish to do it as an individual. He was a budding communist even at that age. And could he please organise some other people and we would do it as an event. And this he did. And in March 1966, 3 of us, the others I've not seen since and I have no idea who they were, we gathered outside Harold Holt's home, somewhere south of the river there, and the cameras are around and some lovely people rallied round and held up banners saying "Make love, not war" and so on, and I burnt the draft card. My poor parents only found out about this in the newspaper because I believed that they would only be worried about me getting myself into trouble. Of course they were delighted, as old communists themselves, it was the best thing since sliced bread. But in retrospect, my instincts weren't completely wrong as it panned out. Anyway, so I found myself then enclosed within a very powerful protective ring of people. I was also doing my final year as a civil engineering student, and this is a very exacting course. And there was an approaching election. You had the court cases arising out of my burning of the draft card, coinciding with me wanting to do my stuff in the exams. So I realised in retrospect that my parents, although they were delighted that I'd taken a stand and I was proving to be my parents' child, they were still mostly motivated by saving my skin. So they organised a QC from the Communist Party. He's a famous gentleman, I'm sure you'll know who it was, but he turned up at the Carlton Magistrates Court to defend me on the charge of having failed to produce my draft card. And I was really an observer in this. I took no part in this action at all. I sat there while he ran this case. It was impossible for me to produce the card because I'd burnt it and there was no law against burning it, which I understand is perfectly good law, but the Carlton magistrate was not going to interfere with government policy and make an adverse decision for the government on that. So I was found guilty and fined about £500. I was pissed off because I was doing this as a gesture. It was a symbolic act, and in my mind at the time, to take a symbolic stand against the law and then plead to technicality was a contradiction in terms. But c'est la vie. Then I thought, well, it's not right that I should pay the fine because we want to set a precedent that if you're fined under these laws, you should never have to pay the fine. The movement should pay. That is to say, you don't go to prison for it, but the movement will bear any costs you incur for defying the law. So we gave $500 to the Youth Campaign Against Conscription, and they just never got round to paying it. So I got within an ace of going to jail, notwithstanding that, before Trevor eventually got down to the Magistrates Court and paid the fine. At this point, my parents cleverly arranged through their network of contacts for a doctor to give me medical certificates, for a travel agent to book me a ticket, and for me to leave the country 2 days after my final exam, 3 days before the 1966 general election, and fly to my uncle's place in Paris. Now, this is how life turned out. I don't regret it because I spent 20 years overseas and I would have left Australia anyway. Before conscription came up, I intended to leave the country. I then found it necessary to take a stand, and that deviated me from fantasies of wandering the streets of Europe as some kind of existential dropout. But that's well, I left, and I made a life mainly in London after that, and came back only in December of 1986. Now, you mentioned before that you'd spoken to a lot of engineering students. Now, it was the conviction who had been conscripted. It was the belief among engineering students that the ballot was so rigged, or the choosing of conscripts was so rigged, that they selected engineering students because they were regarded as good material for the army, and that they didn't want socially critical art students. Now, this has been denied, of course. I heard, I think, Don Chips on record in more recent times as having denied it, but certainly engineering students believe there were far too many of us being picked to be accountable according to statistics. That's my story. Do you want more? Of course, my connection to the anti-conscription movement does go back further, I have to say. I don't know exactly when, maybe July of 1966, I spoke at a meeting in Melbourne Town Hall, or Richmond Town Hall, somewhere, marking the 50th anniversary of the anti-conscription campaign of 1916. And there were a lot of people there from that time, and I asked the chairman to announce that I was my grandfather's brother or something was Frank Hyatt. Frank Hyatt was, of course, this produced a rounding cheer. Although his name's not well known now, he was very well known at the time as the leader of the fight for free speech, the first founding secretary of the Railways Union, and a founding member of the Victorian Socialist Party, and a member of the IWW at the time. My grandfather, that's to say my mother's father, also was in court fighting against conscription. He wrote a pamphlet explaining why the Bible was against conscription. But also he was Oz Barnett was a great social campaigner. He in fact invented evidence-based campaigning, which is taken for granted now, but where you're campaigning on a social issue, instead of just saying, you know, you must stop this poverty, you must give more housing or something, you actually do research and you present a dossier to government proving your case. And he's credited among sociologists of having invented that approach to social activism. But he also was someone that believed in like solving disputes on the golf course, so to speak. And he had friends who had friends, and there's no way he is ever going to be found guilty by any judge. So that's my story. Is there anything else I can add for you?
Yes.
Can I just stop a bit? I've just...
Well, I just had a number of questions earlier. What was the uni environment like for you? You know, the general youth culture sort of thing.
I mean, I was an engineering student. The engineers had a very exacting work program. We were pretty much separate from other students. I mean, as a group, I certainly mixed more with the arts and philosophy type milieu than most of my students did. And I enjoyed the university milieu outside of the engineering school altogether. I really never got on amongst my fellow engineers, but perforce I had to spend a great many hours with them. Very few of them sympathised with my position. As I explained, I was regarded as an oddball among engineers. I did give a talk at the uni on why one should be opposed to the Vietnam War. And I held it in the engineering building, and mostly engineering students turned up. I think I had in the audience one sympathetic listener. But at the same time, I remember when LBJ came by, and the route took him straight past the university. The whole, there were masses of students outside, and altogether a very hostile crowd. So that was very gratifying, because it wasn't really much of what I saw. I left my parental home in 1964, and I was living in the student dumps, half-deserted houses and such like in Carlton. So that kind of university milieu was really quite liberating. So it's a little bit schizophrenic, my university experience. The engineers on one hand during the day and all sorts of alternative type people in the evening, so to speak. Mm-hmm.
Interested in the effect of the youth culture on people, and you know, the songs, the drugs, the free sex.
As I said, my experiences at university as a youth were somewhat schizophrenic in the sense that I was studying together with engineering students who were on the whole very conservative, but my own friends were a completely different social layer altogether, not even exclusively university students, and my friends were radical. That radicalism, well, it certainly involved drugs. I was a great Ritalin user from quite early on. I know it's nothing to do with ADHD, but I used to use that later on, cannabis, much more than marijuana. So my last few years in Australia, not to mention afterwards, had quite a lot of drugs in it, but these are just recreational things. I mean, it doesn't affect what you're doing. It was just part of the scene, as we say. Where I lived in various shared houses mostly, in Carlton, mostly with other students, but not exclusively, also sort of bums that would move in from time to time. I spent a lot of time hitchhiking backwards and forwards between Melbourne and Sydney. I used to sometimes come out of the last lecture on Friday, cross over to Royal Parade and catch the first car north and arrive back on Sunday night with barely enough time to get enough sleep to get to the first lecture. In fact, I rarely caught the first 10 minutes of any of the first lectures of the day. But they had these roller boards, and I used to write everything on the roller board so I could pick it up as it came round again. The milieu was a kind of radical rejectionist one. Look at the story. When I was talking to this 50th anniversary of the 1916 conscription meeting, and I was making some point at the microphone to the effect that it didn't matter that we were a minority, what we were doing was right, and therefore that's what we had to do, even if the majority disagreed. And I heard a voice on the stage behind me say, "He's an anarchist." Now, I had to go home and check out and find out what an anarchist was, but really that was a fair description, and I think really most young people, I mean, if you've not been brought up living any various types of conservatism aside, unless you've been brought up as a communist of some kind, then young people are anarchists in their nature. You have to, and in fact, in relation to war, all young people are pacifists if they're not actually violent people that want war. Their attitude to violence is that they don't want anything to do with it. Civil disobedience and non-violence is something that has to be learnt. And communism is in the same in politics. It has to be learnt. So there's no way I could really be a communist. I was, by disposition, somewhere between a kind of syndicalist and an individual anarchist. And that would have been the predominant milieu around me. When the first Joan Baez record hit Melbourne, which must have been much earlier than that, I think about 1962, I immediately identified with it. I went to the folk clubs in Toorak somewhere, I think, and in South Melbourne. Glenn Thomas said he was a family friend. I mean, I mentioned that my family, who were kind of like non-practicing communists, you might say, and they had that intellectual kind of milieu of writers and artists around them. Madeline Marshall was a family friend as well, and I was lucky in that way that I simply absorbed that view of the world. The only politics I learnt at home was my father's rabid and unceasing anti-Americanism, which pretty well the house was anti-American, but it was not really politically developed in any way. I didn't have any friends who were conscripted because I was always a bit younger than my milieu, so they had all the people I knew simply just weren't touched by it. They, of course, rejected it like we rejected everything to do with the government. I regarded the Communist Party actually as part of the system, even though in retrospect I know how totally unfair that was. And I never really had a lot of time for Jim Cairns either. Again, utterly unfair. The guy played a fantastic role at that time. But my consciousness at the time that everyone was really part of the system and I wanted nothing to do with it. I wasn't going to fight your wars, I wasn't going to have your draft card, and as a matter of fact, I would get the hell out of this country as soon as possible. So easily I could have stayed and gone on being defiant. There's no way my personality would ever have put on a uniform. Just that would never have happened. I didn't fancy indefinite jail. You have to understand, in 1966, in that election, for instance, November 66, when the Labor Party, bless their souls, took a clear stand against the Vietnam War and against conscription, they were slaughtered in the polls. And I knew they were going to be slaughtered before the election because the public was behind the war. There was no sign of what would happen later. I mean, I participated in London in the big events of 60, 68, 67, and it was those events that really changed my life and politicised me, and it was the experiences of 68 that defined my life ever since, rather than my symbolic stand in 66, even though that set me on a certain course. Because in my opinion, it's not the youth milieu or the drugs and sex and rock and roll that defined our lives politically. It was the mass movement. And once you've been part of a mass movement, I mean, that's it. You're set in a way. You can belong to a party or a group, of people or a milieu, and you grow out of that. But once you've participated in a mass movement, that's it. It defines the meaning of your life. And even though I'm not in a situation to participate in any way anymore, and there's precious little to participate in, for Christ's sake, I remain in whatever way I can dedicated to a fight for socialism. I mean, it never was just peace for me. I adopted the mantle of conscientious objection. I mean, I can say it now, but I never was really a pacifist in that religious theoretical sense. I was a pacifist by disposition, but I wanted the other side to win. And of course, as a pacifist, you can't have that position. So I knew that if I ever had to defend my pacifism in court, it would never stand up. I mean, even genuine, Bible-bashing, heartfelt pacifists couldn't get through the hoops they put up for you in court. So I never do that. When I gave my talk to fellow engineering students, I said, look, I'm a pacifist, because I had to say that, but I'm going to argue the case against the Vietnam War, not as a pacifist, because I think they should win. And that was sort of among friends, if you like, my position. I know I've seen things, people argue about whether the right position was to end conscription or whether it should have been to get out of Vietnam, and questions like this. And I was far too young and politically naive to understand the nuances of this. I was confronted with it. What position should you take? Should you take a position that the war was entirely wrong, that the capitalist system was fucked and should go, or should you take a position that would better connect with the mass of the population? And I was sort of persuaded, and let's face it, the Communist Party of the day, only coming out of the McCarthyite period, was very much dedicated. I mean, they were active in trade unions, but politically they were almost invisible. They were disguised in all sorts of peace movements and women's unions and all sorts of things. The Folk Club, I later also hated go. The capitalist system was fucked and should go. Or should you take a position that would better connect with the mass of the population? And I was sort of persuaded, and let's face it, the Communist Party of the day, only coming out of the McCarthyite period, was very much dedicated. I mean, they were active in trade unions, but politically they were almost invisible. They were disguised in all sorts of peace movements and women's unions and all sorts of things. The folk club, I later realised from people I met at Arena, these folk music clubs were run by communists. Joan Baez herself was a communist, apart from being brought up as a Quaker. I never realised, right? So their position was, of course, to not to take defiant, sort of noble stands and be shot down and die a martyr, but to try and connect with the masses somehow. And later I learned about political theory and I got to understand why you have to do that. This was not my consciousness at the time, but nevertheless, through discussion with more politically experienced people, what I said in public was things like the United Nations should solve it, U Thant should intervene to stop this war, and things like this, which never believed at the time, but it was the kind of thing I believed that you're supposed to say when you spoke in public. So there was a bit of schizophrenia there as well. And I'm sure a couple of years later, no one would be bother saying these kind of politically correct things. People were quite happy to say stuff, a lot of it, I'm not taking part. Oh, hell no. That's the thing, isn't it? Hell no, we won't go. Yeah.
And just to go back to the youth campaign against conscription, start again with how you got involved and what you found there.
I don't know how I found the youth campaign against conscription, quite honestly, but I did find them, and I think I found them by attending events that I heard about, like a demonstration outside the place where people turned up to be inducted into the army, or a demonstration, in some public place that I began to participate in. And they were young people, but they were a bit older than me. There weren't any people that young as me, involved in fighting against conscription at the time. So the youth campaign against conscription, they were 19, 20, 21-year-olds, they were not old people, they were youth, definitely, but they were just a bit older than to have been conscripted. And they kept a low profile. I believe now that probably it wouldn't be too wrong to describe them as a front for the Communist Party, because so many of them had parents who were Communist Party members. Oh, your parents were in the Communist Party. Fancy that. They were, can I put it, they were young activists. The young activists then, just as you find them today, planning the demonstrations, looking out for likely recruits, discussing, these things. They were not sex, drugs and rock and roll people, actually. They were 100 times more politically conscious than I was, but they were more conventional, I think, in dress and tastes and things.
And what did you do with them?
Oh, look, the closest I got to inside participation is I turned up to someone's house once to help paint banners. Generally speaking, I was a foot soldier that simply turned up at demonstrations and shouted or marched or whatever was required at the time. And just on one of these occasions, after a demo, as I said, I pulled Trevor aside and said, that I wanted to burn my draft card. And then he got in touch with me, told me where to be, at what time, and I turned up. So my contact with them was very light. I never, apart from that, involved myself in any decision-making processes.
So why did you want to burn your draft card?
Because of a feeling of it's a combination of things. Often these things come together as two. One, as a person, I knew it was utterly impossible that I should be in the army. It was just untenable. And I had a self-knowledge and understanding of what it means to be in a war. This was before conscripts had been sent to Vietnam, by the way. At that time, conscripts were just doing training at Dun Truon or something. But even that I knew was impossible for me as a person. So that combined with a long-standing, very deep, though inchoate sense of social justice. I could see clearly that, I mean, I regarded the Victorian Liberal government as the sort of the parliamentary wing of organised crime. You know how in the old days families would send someone into the church, someone into politics and someone into the army. Well, they sent someone into the army, someone into politics and someone into organised crime. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was my conviction. And the idea that these people, I mean, it only became a thing for me when they reached out and touched me. As a young person, I sort of proceeded on the conviction that that was their world, it was nothing to do with me. I didn't bother with their fashions, I didn't bother with their laws. Okay, I was an engineering student, but that was a kind of anomaly, that a decision I made when I was a school child, for Christ's sake, and just followed through. I got my passport at a very young age, but it was blocked because I was too young to have a passport, and my mother said that she would sign it for me to have, provided I promised to finish my course before leaving the country. So that was a fair deal, and I did finish my course and then I left the country. So the consciousness that brought me to burn my draft card is to bring together of two things: an understanding that it was an impossibility for me as a person, and an understanding that it was utterly unjust. Not just the conscription part of it, but the whole war was unjust. And either it was sufficient grounds to defy the law, but I know that if they'd conscripted somebody else apart from me, I probably would have just become involved a few years later along with masses of other people. But they prodded me and said, hey, you're involved here. And I never realised that. I thought I could live in my own world. I did always act as if I was in a world of my own. I remember my girlfriend saying once, and you've made a fashion statement of dirty white shirts. Right? So I wasn't necessarily wearing a caftan or something, and I wasn't dressed. I wore a dirty white shirt. So that tells you anything. Yeah?
And why did you want to leave Australia?
Well, there was a thing. Why did I want to leave Australia? Well, there was a thing actually of catching cattle boats to Kuwait, which is what the hip people were sort of doing. A mad fantasy. I mean, I really knew myself in the same way that I was never going to join the army. I was never going to go to Vietnam and desert or any such thing. Nor was I going to survive a cattle boat to Kuwait. But at a very younger age, I'm talking like when I'm, I don't know, 17 or something, that was an idea. But Australia was such a backwater. I mean, look at the people. I mean, the majority of the population thought Bob Menzies was clever. You know, they thought Balti was honest. I mean, how could you live in a country where Bob Menzies was clever and Balti was honest? I mean, this was impossible. Meanwhile, I mean, things were getting swing. London was starting to swing. I didn't even actually want to go to London. That was just too old hat. I wanted to go to Europe, where people spoke different languages and there was real culture. My mother was right in that, of course. I was too young. A couple more years and I was probably old enough to defend as it turned out, of course, I was chucked out of the country. I had to go, and I was very, very much on my own without any prospect of ever returning. Though, of course, things changed. Mass movements arose, and that whole picture changed. But one has to understand a couple of things about the political culture of Australia. The 1960s arrived very late in Australia. It was really the 70s by the time 1960s arrived. 1960s in Australia is what people mean when they say the 1950s. Right? There was nothing 1960s about 1966 Melbourne. Right? It was 1950s. It was very conservative. It was a very repressed culture. The only thing 1960s about is there were a few people, a minority of people like me, you know, that there weren't in the 50s so much. Oh, there were the beatniks, you know, that scientific sort of layer, amazing layer. But I suppose that was it. We were still a very small, very alienated minority. The overwhelming culture still lived in the 1950s. And the other thing is young 17-year-olds today are so political, so aware of the world. They don't know much, but they know what's happening around the world. They're much more critical. They don't believe anything their parents say once they've gone past that critical stage of of young teenagehood, they're much more politically aware. I mean, they have a much better education. As a 20-year-old in Melbourne, I knew nothing, and that's me, who was relatively politically ultra-conscious compared to my fellows. It was very young. 20 was very young in those days. And by conscripting people at the age of 20 was really a dreadful thing to do, because I knew what it meant. None of the other kids that were being conscripted knew what they were going into. And it must have been a terrible shock when they arrived and found they weren't welcome by the local people.
You stood as a candidate in the federal seat of Chisholm?
No, I didn't. This was proposed.
Oh, tell me what was proposed.
It was proposed that I would stand as a candidate against Don Chipp, I think. You have to check the facts on that, but whoever was the Defence Minister at the time, and I thought this was a good idea, but the fact was the election was due to actually happen days after my final exams, and I was easily convinced that I couldn't combine the two, and I went to see the head of engineering to ask if I could get a postponement of my exams in order to run in the election, and he said no. So I thought, well, no big deal. I'll do my exams and the election will take care of itself.
Who are you going to run for?
Oh, just as an anti-conscription candidate, not as a Labor Party member.
So was this a plan of the youth campaign against conscription?
I don't know where it originated, but the idea would be I would stand as an anti-conscription candidate, not a Labor Party candidate or a Communist Party candidate. I don't know. I knew nothing at the time. It was really, I wasn't involved in that decision, except that in the end I decided, I didn't develop that decision. I was approached, and actually I think it was my father that told me about it. Ralph was my father. He was a little bit like he was living his misspent youth. That is to say, his youth he didn't get to misspend. He could live through me, and he was enjoying all this. So whether he cooked up the scheme or whether he just conveyed it to me, I don't know. But no, it never happened.
I had read something somewhere. Oh yes, what I wanted to ask you is a bit more theoretical or analytical or something. Was the youth campaign against conscription and anti-conscription at that time a nationalist or an internationalist movement in Australia?
Was the anti-conscription campaign nationalist or internationalist? Well, that's really a kind of question that can only be asked from outside. It is, as you mentioned, analytical question. That didn't rise for me at all. What do you think now? In retrospect, it was, well, put it this way, where did I get the idea to burn my draft card from? I accept I didn't invent that idea. I got it by watching the news of what was happening in America. I felt myself, in my participation in the anti-conscription movement, to be part of a worldwide movement against the Vietnam War. But specifically, the question at issue was conscription, and that had a history in Australia, and there was a national and a local character to that. But I certainly saw the whole thing as an international movement. I think genuinely it was. There was an interchange of ideas around the different movements across the world.
Can you hear that music?
Yeah.
Oh shit. Are they back in there again?
Here we go, see them?
Yep.
And we're rolling now.
Yeah. There was nothing nationalist about the campaign against conscription in Australia. I'm not aware. Understanding I'm talking about a short window of that movement prior to the 1966 election. I'm not aware of any feeling that this was about saving Australian lives, or this is not Australia's war, or anything like that. It was simply in the consciousness of those who were involved that the Vietnam War was wrong, and Australia and America, or no other country, had a right to be interfering in the affairs of Vietnam. And the focus on conscription was a very rational decision that was had the best chance of keying into a mass movement, which turned out to be the case.
When you say it turned out to be the case, what do you think? Just can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, of course. I'm talking about something I don't really know about here, because I only knew about the movement that developed in Australia by vague reports. But I understand it did become a mass. The anti-war movement became a mass movement pretty well everywhere. It certainly was in Britain. It wasn't a participant in the war, and it certainly was in America. I don't even think of the anti-Vietnam War movement as a peace movement, in the sense that it wasn't just for peace. It was specifically aimed at an imperialist intervention. So I lost the drift of what...
Contribution of...
Oh, yeah. Well, in what sense was anti-conscription the key thing? As I said, that I have the impression that those who refused to register for the draft, which was a factor that came later, that simply wasn't an issue. I never heard it mentioned as an option in 1966. But when you had large numbers of people refusing to register and that way making themselves symbols of the opposition to the war, and then by defying the law and challenging the state to arrest them and jail them, created a kind of focus that you can't get by just being against a war unless you have soldiers. If you have soldiers that are saying, no, this war is wrong, we're not going to fight it, then you can have an anti-war movement. But it's very difficult when you've got a professional army that's quite happy to fight a war to have an anti-war movement. By introducing conscription, the government simply delivered to the opposition the symbolic means of having a mass anti-war movement. I mean, I've looked a bit at the American anti-war, or the American peace movement began as an anti-nuclear thing, and it was quite a big movement, the Women's Strike for Peace and so on. I don't want to put it down, but it really took off when you suddenly had lots of young American men who were avoiding the draft. That's when it became a really strong mass movement. And I believe it's unlikely any time in future that any Western government will use conscription again. I mean, it's obsolete from the military point of view. Politically, it's just stupid. But, I mean, we had stupid politicians in those days. Oh, those days. Jeez, we have stupid politicians today. Tony Abbott belongs firmly in the 50s. Yes.
And in that time, did you encounter the Save Our Sons movement?
I think that's after my time. Glenn Tomasetti was a family friend, and her name's identified with that movement. My mother was a rank-and-file participant in it. But as far as I'm aware, that was post-1966. If I'm wrong there, which I could well be.
I think it was just starting up.
Yeah.
My next question is one that you've, in a way, answered, but I'd like to have it again, because it might be different. What would you say was the effect on your life of conscription and your refusal to comply?
Well, first off, it politicised me.
No, instead of saying it, say...
I'm sorry. The being conscripted, that politicised me. Being conscripted meant irrefutably that I would defy that and set me on a course then, not just of a generalised anarchistic youth that didn't believe in things, but someone who was acting against the government and the system. And that was a change in my personality, which was consolidated by the mass movement that later took place. If it hadn't have been a mass movement, then it wouldn't have had the same impact on my personality. It would have just gone along with my generalised kind of anarchism. But because the mass movement developed, then that made me feel part of something bigger than myself, which was worth being part of, namely a communist movement, a socialist movement, a workers' movement, something of that kind. And in 1968, I started reading Marxism, and I've been a Marxist ever since. Of course, I knew nothing of Marxist theory at all in 1966. Though I did things which would seem to defy that. For example, I remember in 6th grade primary school, when the teacher was out of the room, going up to the front and drawing a hammer and sickle on the board, which the guy was an old McCarthyite terror, and he knew immediately who it was. He said, "Blunden, wipe that off." So that was a lesson, but it's an anomaly in my own mind. I think I just did it as a measure of defiance. I knew it would spite him, so I did it. I always felt an empathy to the Soviet Union, but at the same time I was repelled by Stalinism, and I regarded as a youth, the communists, well, can I put it different? Those sort of intellectual communists I sort of liked. How did it affect me? Well, it then projected me, of course, to the other side of the world, and I lived the rest of my life as a kind of foreigner. Now, a lot of people that went to London in the 60s and who became famous figures in Australian literature and so on since were a couple of years older than me, and they also left Australia with degrees in literary criticism and so on, and they were much better able to deal with it. I wound up in London with a degree in civil engineering, but no interest at all in being an engineer, sort of more or less on my own, though Australians collected together, you know, like drops of oil on water, so there were plenty of Australians. But eventually, you know, I found myself living in East London, not knowing any other Australians really, and not involved in any kind of movement. But I certainly was a Marxist, and I got involved in left-wing politics there. And for 11 years, I was a member of an outfit called the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which was an experience. My time could probably have been spent better, but nevertheless, it was an experience. And I returned to Australia and continued as a Trotskyist and involved in very small group type of politics. Eventually, the total collapse of anything like an organised socialist movement, the disappearance of organised Trotskyism followed on from the disappearance of organised Stalinism, you know, maybe a decade later, but just as thoroughly. And my last involvement with any centrist outfit, let alone communist outfit, was maybe around the late 90s or something. It became obvious that kind of politics was now obsolete. It was impossible. I belong to the Greens now. You as well, yes. All my old communist friends, the best of them anyway, belong to the Greens now. That's not to say the Greens are communists. They're not. I keep my politics to myself. I just do what I can to help them because they're the best thing going at the moment. And we'll see what comes. You know? take a position that would better connect with the mass of the population.